Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 8 from Eutropius's Breviarium, right? And so we're talking about the Second Punic War still. And in part 7, the first sort of chapter where he talks about Hannibal, we learned a little bit about Hannibal, his activities in Spain. The siege of Saguntum was brought up. And now we're shifting gears to sort of the response. We had war being declared on the Carthaginians by Rome. And, now we're into the aftermath of what happens after the siege of Saguntum. And we're setting up Hannibal's, famous crossing of the Alps. Okay. So again, if you haven't done it, I'd highly recommend you dive into the background, the history of the Second Punic War, particularly Hannibal's invasion of Italy. So you can understand the references that Eutropius is making. And again, all the really interesting details that he's leaving out. He is giving you a very brief history with the assumption that his audience would probably know a lot about this. But for us, if you're not familiar with it, it can be a little tricky to follow exactly what he's talking about. And there are times where he's condensed, Eutropius has condensed a few years of history into one line, or it kind of comes off as happening in the same year when it didn't. So it's good just to go back and make sure that you're feeling good. But either way, once you're ready to dive in, this is chapter 8 and how we start. So you have tum, right? Right off the bat, we have then, right? It's talking about the response of the Romans to Hannibal and his siege of Saguntum. You have tum, Publius Cornelius Scipio cum exercitu in Hispaniam profectus est, Titus Sempronius in Siciliam. So the first line, like I said, has then. It's a nice little transition word of, the response of the Romans after they've declared war. You have Publius Cornelius Scipio. So I'm going to pause here. This is one of the more famous characters, in the Roman Republic, and particularly the Second Punic War. This is not Scipio Africanus, the Scipio who ends up defeating the Carthaginians in Hannibal. This is his father. Okay, so you should definitely look him up. He's a very famous Roman, probably the most powerful Roman general at the time, and he's the one who leads out the army in response to Hannibal and his aggression, in Spain. So you have Publius Cornelius Scipio. Cum exercitu just means with the army, right, or with an army. Then you have in Hispaniam profectus est. So profectus est is a deponent verb. It looks like it would be perfect passive, but you have to remember what exactly this word is. It's the verb proficiscor, which means to set out or to depart. So it looks passive, but we're going to translate it actively. So it's saying he departed, or he set out, you might say, in Hispaniam into Spain. Okay, so that's his response. They send Publius Cornelius Scipio to Spain, and then you have Titus Sempronius, another sort of famous Roman at the time, right? You have to imply profectus est again. He set out in Siciliam, into Sicily. So if you're thinking of a map at the time of the Mediterranean, the Punic Wars, Sicily is a really key area. That's where the first Punic War was fought. And the Romans have this fear that the Carthaginians are going to attack Sicily again. It's really important that they hold it. So they're trying to think of where the Carthaginians will come from, and they kind of spread their forces in two places. One group goes to Sicily under Sempronius. The other group goes to Spain to deal with Hannibal under Publius Cornelius Scipio. Okay. Then you have Hannibal, relicto in Hispania fratre Hasdrubale Pyreneum transit, right? So Hannibal, there's your subject. You have this ablative absolute, so relicto and fratre, right? You have the participle and you have the ablative noun fratre, and it's actually fratre Hasdrubale, right? So this whole piece is an ablative absolute. So you could say Hannibal with his brother Hasdrubal having been left behind, or you might even translate it having left behind his brother Hasdrubal. Okay, Hasdrubal is another famous character from the Second Punic War. You're going to see that when, kind of like Eutropius is laying out here, when Hannibal goes into Italy, his brother Hasdrubal is left behind in Spain to make sure that the Romans don't take over all this area that the Barcas had claimed. Okay, so with his brother Hasdrubal having been left behind in Hispania, in Spain, right? It's just ablative because you're showing where he is. You have transit Pyreneum, right? He crossed over transit the Pyrenees, right? Pyreneum is referring to the mountains, right? The Pyrenees mountains is the mountain chain that blocks or divides basically modern day France and Spain. So he crosses over those mountains. He's headed to Italy. Then you have Alpes ad hoc ea parte in vias sibi patafecit. Okay, so it's referring to the Alps, right? Alpes, the Alps. Okay, and there's a side note here, ad hoc, right? Still, ea parte, in that part. Okay, so when you have in that part, what you're really missing is the participle, not the participle, the preposition in, right? In this part, you might say. It's just showing the place where something happened, right? It's referring to the Alps, right? So in this part, in Vias, it's still impassable. Okay, so in Vias is referring to Alpes. Okay, so it's an adjective, in Vias, right? Just means impassable. And the Alps are a feminine noun, right? It's referring to the mountain chain. Okay, so those two words are describing each other. So it's sort of the side note here of the Alps, still impassable in this part. You have patefeket, he opened up. Okay, then you have this dative of interest, right? It's reflexive for himself, right? It's referring to Hannibal. It means that he crossed over the Alps. And patefakio is a really interesting verb to choose, because the whole idea of the Second Punic War and Hannibal crossing the Alps and why it's so famous is because nobody thought it could be done. So the idea of him opening it up for himself is kind of a clever wordplay, because it does kind of show Hannibal's force of will, where the Alps are not going to let you cross over. You need to kind of force your way through. And again, notice how Eutropius has taken one of the more famous parts of the Second Punic War and condensed it down into one sentence. That is kind of the essence of what he's doing here with this brief history of Rome. You could have spent, chapters talking about Hannibal and the resistance he met in the Alps and all the men he lost. He doesn't dwell on that, right? And it goes back to the bias. Why don't you dwell on that? Well, because he's really trying to get the story more about the Romans, right? The story is not so much about Hannibal and how great he was, but it's more about the Roman response to him, right? So you can kind of see the bias coming into play here. But the idea is Hannibal crosses the Alps, okay? Then in the last line here, you have traditor, okay? So traditor means like it is said or he is said, and you can tell already that we're setting up for an indirect statement, right? It's said that something happened, okay? So you have traditor ad Italiam, then you have LXX, right, 80, milia peditum, ex milia equitum septem et XXX, right, 30, elephantos adduxisse, okay? So it's said or he is said. What was said about him? Well, he has said, adduxisse. You have this perfect infinitive at the end of the line, to have brought, okay? And you have to imply the accusative, which is what we're missing here for the indirect discourse. You have to imply Hannibalum. So you could either say he is said, or you could say it is said that Hannibal, which is the missing accusative, brought, right, is said to have brought. Ad Italiam is telling you where he went, to Italy, right? Then you have 80,000, right? So LXX milia, 80,000s, it's plural, of infantry. Peditum is really referring to like foot soldiers, right? You have the word, for foot, kind of part of that word. So he brought this many infantry, right? A lot of guys, and 10,000s of cavalry. Okay, so 80,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and septem et XXX. So XXX is 30. 30 and 7 is 37. So and 37 elephantos, elephants. Okay? So this is the number that Eutropius gives for how many, what the troop composition of the army that Hannibal brings. He claims it's 80,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. So this is interesting, and I'll show my own ignorance here. I don't remember the exact amount that's agreed upon, but I would say that this number is high, right? So what Eutropius is probably talking about is the number that Hannibal brought before he crossed the Alps, because if I remember correctly, most of these elephants die, obviously crossing the Alps, and he doesn't show up to Italy with this large of an army. So again, whenever you have numbers in a history, you have to kind of be a little skeptical about where these numbers came from, or the estimates, like where did you hear this from? You have to remember Eutropius is writing this about 600, give or take, years after the event happened, but you can look it up. He has a big army that he leads to Italy. It's a smaller army by the time he gets there, is kind of how I would encourage you to think about it. But either way, he's giving you an idea of who Hannibal brought to Italy, and the elephants are kind of the cool part that everyone focuses on. He brings war elephants, which are, basically sort of like modern day tanks, right? And that's what makes the Second Punic War so interesting. Part of it is Hannibal and the army he brings. Then you get to the last part of this chapter. You have interea multi legores et Galli Hannibali se conjuxerunt. Okay? So interea means meanwhile. You have multi legores et Galli, so many Ligurians and Gauls. This is an interesting detail that Eutropius puts in, which is great. And it's really referring to who Hannibal picks up along the way. right? So the Ligurians, the Gauls, if you read the history, Hannibal meets some resistance going through Gaul, modern day France, right, to get to the Alps. And what he does, that Eutropius is kind of glossing over, is Hannibal shows his really strong statesman and political ability, his diplomacy. He turns the Gauls, who are not big fans of the Carthaginians, but he turns them against the Romans. And it's sort of this idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So the Gauls and the Romans have been fighting in northern Italy and sort of southern France for a long time. And Hannibal is saying to them, hey, I know we don't like each other, but I'm going to go attack the Romans. Don't you want to get some revenge too? And he gets a lot of these tribes to join up with him and join his army. So when you have se conjuxera, that literally means they joined themselves, right? And you have the reflexive pronoun there, to Hannibal. Okay, so they joined themselves to him, meaning they allied with Hannibal. So again, when you get that troop number from Eutropius of how big Hannibal's army is, you have to remember that part of it is Hannibal is replenishing his numbers by getting local Gallic tribes in northern Italy in different places to join him. But again, look up the history on your own. There's a ton you could learn about this. But in terms of what Eutropius writes, that's it, right? Many Ligurians and Gauls join themselves to Hannibal. Then you have Sempronius Gracchus, cognito ad Italiam Hannibalis adventu, ex Sicilia exercitum Arminum triace. Okay, so Sempronius Gracchus, okay, so the guy who got sent to Sicily, okay, you have an ablative absolute of cognito adventu. So having learned, or you might even say with the adventu, with the arrival, Hannibalis of Hannibal, having been learned. Okay, cognito. So you could even translate having learned about, right? Having learned the arrival of Hannibal ad Italiam to Italy. Okay, so it's saying when he learned about this, he triaced, he sent over, is kind of one way to translate it, his exercitum, the army, ex Sicilia, out of Sicily, and then you have Ariminum, right, which is an accusative of place to which. There's no preposition needed because you're talking about a city, right? So the accusative implies you're going towards Arminium, okay, which is in northern Italy. So the general idea here, again, is that when the Romans send out, their forces, one goes to Sicily and then Cornelius Scipio goes to Spain. The interesting part, if you're wondering what happened here, and again, I'll just touch on a little bit and you should go look up the history yourself. The interesting part is Scipio and Hannibal, they kind of meet each other, not in a full battle, but in sort of a cavalry skirmish. But Scipio keeps going to Spain, not fully understanding, what is about to happen. He probably thought Hannibal wouldn't make it over the Alps or get killed by the Gauls, right? So he keeps going to Spain. So there isn't really a strong army in the north. And once Hannibal has crossed and the Romans realize that he's in Italy, there's a panic mode of like, what are we going to do? So they recall the army from Sicily to go face Hannibal. So you can tell in the way Eutropius is setting this up, you're getting a little bit of the Roman response, right? Of, oh God, Hannibal just crossed the Alps. It's something they were never expecting him to do, but he does it, okay? So that's chapter 8. The Latin itself, nothing too crazy. There's a few ablative absolutes, which are really common when you're reading, Roman history. Just spot them, translate them, usually with blank having been blanked is a decent translation. There's a bunch of other ways you can do it. But otherwise, there's nothing too crazy here. And again, Eutropius is giving you sort of the glossed version of what happened. So I would highly recommend that while you're reading Eutropius, what I would do in my class is have a video, covering the Punic Wars ready to go so you can watch and read Eutropius and see how they match, or any article, anything you can find to kind of fill in the gaps, because Eutropius is not giving you the full story. Okay, but hopefully this made some sense. If you have any questions at all, like I tell you, put them in the comments below. I'd be happy to help you. But otherwise, just keep reading it, keep practicing, look at some grammar notes. And the more you go through this, the more comfortable you're going to be with Eutropius' style. Good luck.